should ascribe to them mythological deeds. Yet the ancient mythologies of the Chaldeans, the Greeks, the Romans, the Hindus, the Mayans, preoccupy themselves not with the sun or the moon, but prima facie with the planets. Marduk, the great god of the Babylonians, was the planet Jupiter. So was Ammon of the Egyptians, Zeus of the Greeks, and Jupiter of the Romans. It was much superior to Shamash, Helios, the sun. Why was it revered by all peoples? Why was the planet Mars chosen to be the personification of the god of war? Why did Kronos of the Greeks, Saturn of the Romans, play a part in hundreds of myths and legends? Thoth of the Egyptians, Nebo and Nergal of the Babylonians, Mithra and Mazda of the Persians, Vishnu and Shiva of the Hindus, Bachi-Palazzi and Quetzalcoatl of the Mexicans were a personification of planets. Innumerable hymns were dedicated to them, and adventures and exploits ascribed to them. The life of our planet has its real source in the sun, wrote E. Renan. All force is a transformation of the sun. Before religion had gone so far as to proclaim that God must be placed in the absolute and the ideal, that is to say, outside of the world, one cult only was reasonable and scientific, and that was the cult of the sun. But the sun was subordinate to the planets, even though they are not conspicuous, poor sources of light, and no sources of warmth. The night sky illuminated by stars is majestic. The geometrical figures of the constellations such as Pleiades, Orion, the Great Bear, rolling from east in the evening to west before morning, are favorite motifs in poetry, no less than the sun and the moon. But the discrepancy in the choice of motifs by the ancients becomes still more obvious. The constellations of the sky took only a minor and incidental part in the mythology of the ancient peoples. The planets were the major gods, and they rule the universe. It is not easy to understand the idea, which was the basis for the identification of the Babylonian gods with the planets, writes an author, but the same process of identification of major gods with the planets can be found in the religions of the peoples in all parts of the world. The planets were not affiliated to the gods or symbols of the gods. They were the gods. In prayers and liturgies, they were invoked as gods. The greater gods, even when addressed by the name in prayer, were regarded as astral powers. This or that planet is selected according to the text of the prayer from the multitude of the stars of heaven to receive a gift. The planetary gods are much the most powerful of all. Their positions in the sky, their reciprocal relations, have a decisive influence on all physical and moral phenomena of the world. The great majority of us moderns pay no attention to these points in the night sky, and probably not 1 in 10 or even in 100 is able to point to Jupiter or Mars in the firmament. The planets change their places, but not conspicuously. Were they indebted for their deification to this slow movement by which they differ from the fixed stars? Did Zeus, Jupiter, Marduk, Ammon become the supreme deity, the thunderer and dreadful lord of the universe, only because of his slow movement? He passes in 12 years the cycle of the zodiac, traversed by the sun in 24 hours, and by the moon even quicker. When seen with the naked eye, the planet Jupiter distinguishes itself from the fixed stars of first magnitude only by this slow change of position. Augustine, confused by the problem of the deification of the planets, wrote in the 4th century, "But possibly these stars, which have been called by their names, are these gods. They call a certain star Mercury, and likewise a certain other star Mars. But among those stars, which are called by the name of gods, is that one which they call Jupiter, and yet with them Jupiter is the world. There also is that one they call Saturn, and yet they give him no small property beside, namely all seeds. Mercury, the closest to the sun, is barely visible, being hidden in the sun's rays. But the ancients made the planet Mercury into a great god, Hermes, or Nebo. Why was it feared and worshipped? What is there generally in the planets to inspire awe, so as to influence people to build temples for them, to sing liturgies, to bring sacrifices, to narrate legends, and to dedicate to them the domain of science, of war, of agriculture? The key to this problem, which is the major problem of all classical mythology, is already in our hands. The planet Venus was deified because of its dramatic appearance and because of the havoc it brought to the world, as described in Worlds in Collision. I illuminated also the events which made Mars a feared god. Divine qualities were ascribed to the other planets because of the catastrophes they wrought in earlier ages. In the Persian holy books, it is said that on the planets depends the existence or non-existence of the world. Wherefore are they especially to be venerated? The 7 planets rule the universe, says a Nabatean inscription. The Greeks and Romans believed that everything is in fact subject to the changes brought about by the revolutions of the stars. The celestial orbs, by their combined movements, are the authors of all that was and is to come. According to ancient Hebrew traditions, there are 7 archangels, each of whom is associated with a planet. The 7 archangels were believed to play an important part in the universal order through their associations with the planets. The reason for the deification of the planets lay in the fact that the planets, only a short time ago, were not faultlessly circling celestial bodies, nor were they harmless. This is also expressed in a Mandean text. How cruel are the planets to stay there and conspire evil in their rage. The planets conspire in rage against us. References. These identifications are discussed below, Part 4, Jupiter of the Thunderbolt. That's the chapter I'm about to get into. I've been reading in the beginning. For ancient planetary worship among the Babylonians, among the Egyptians,
Astronomische und astrologische Inschriften al Egyptische Denkmäler Leipzig 1883 E-Novel The Destruction des Hommes par les Dieux Transactions of the Society for Biblical Archaeology IV 1875 pp.
Haha, he can read all the tough words.
Norgebauer and Apaka, Egyptian Astronomical Texts, London, 1969. Among the Hebrews, C.M. Seligson, Star Worship in the Jewish Encyclopedia, New York, 1905 cf. L. Ginsberg, The Legends of the Jews, Philadelphia, 1925, Volume 3, p. 371, Volume 6.
Among the Persians, see the
Dabistan.
The Dabistan. Babylonian Magic and Sorcery, London, 1896. L.W. King. I'd like to get a hold of that book. Maybe not. I don't know. The City of God, 1907, by M. Dodds. This was the teaching of Anaxagoras, as reported Diogenes. The deification of the planets is advocated in the Platonic Eponymus 471. The origin of belief among the Greeks in the divinity of the heavenly bodies. Harvard, 1940. Symbolism, astronomy, mystique, Jewish magic and superstition, New York, 1939. And that's about it. In case you were wondering about the deification of the planets, there it is. You know, with this Saturn theory, Saturn was called the god of seeds, or of sowing, also the lord of field fruits. A deluge destroying much faunal life must have caused a dissemination of plants. In many places, new forms of vegetation must have sprouted from the rich soil fertilized by lava and mud. Seeds were carried from all parts of the globe, and in many instances, because of the change in climate, they were able to grow in new surroundings. The axis of the Earth was displaced, the orbit changed, the speed of rotation altered, the conditions of irrigation became different. The composition of the atmosphere was not the same. Entirely new conditions of growth prevailed. Ovid thus describes the exuberant growth of vegetation following the flood. After the old moisture remaining from the flood had grown warm from the rays of the sun, the slime of the wet marshes swelled with heat, and the fertile seeds of life nourished in that life-giving soil, as in a mother's womb, grew, and in time took on some special form. When, therefore, the earth covered with mud from the recent flood became heated up by the hot and genial rays of the sun, she brought forth innumerable forms of life, in part of ancient shapes, and in part creatures new and strange. The innumerable new forms of life in the animal and plant kingdoms following the deluge could have been solely a result of multiple mutations, although this seems a sufficient explanation of why and how Saturn came to be credited with the work of dissemination and mutation. The mention of another possibly should not be omitted. If it is true that the Earth passed through the gases exploded from Saturn, it should not be entirely excluded that germs were carried together with meteorites and gases and thus reached the Earth. The scholarly world in recent years has occupied itself with the idea that microorganisms, living cells or spores, can reach the Earth from interstellar spaces. Carried along by the pressure of light rays, the explosion of a planet is a more likely method of carrying seeds and spores through interplanetary spaces. The new forms of life could be the result of mutations, a subject I have discussed in Earth and Abuse, but the possibility that seeds were carried away from an exploding planet cannot be dismissed either. Saturn was credited with the introduction of agriculture in Italy. In Greece, Kronos was closely associated with the harvest of grain. Among the Egyptians, it was said that Osiris is seed. And in Babylonia, during the festival marking the drowning of Tammuz, grains and plants were thrown upon the waves. Tammuz. In Babylonia, during the festival marking the drowning of Tammuz, grains and plants were thrown upon the waves. The effects of nearby supernovae on the biospheres have been the object of intensive study by a geologist in recent years. In an attempt to account for abrupt changes in the history of life on this planet, C.D. Russell and W. Tucker, Supernova and the Extinction of the Dinosaurs, Nature, February 19, 1971. Sudden extinctions were followed by the appearance of new species, quite different from those preceding them in the stratigraphic record. In a relatively brief interval, whole genera were annihilated, giving way to new creatures of radically different aspect, having little in common with the forms they replaced. N.D. Newell, Revolution in the History of Life, Geological Society of America, Special Papers. Punctuated equilibria, the tempo and mode of evolution reconsidered, 1977. Thus, over the past 2 to 3 decades, many geologists and paleontologists have found themselves increasingly drawn to the view that the observed abrupt changes in the biosphere, such as that which marked the end, the Mesozoic, and is thought to have brought with it the extinction of the dinosaurs, among other animal groups, could best be explained by the exposure of then living organisms to massive doses of radiation coming from a nearby supernova. The radiation would annihilate many species, especially those whose representatives, whether because of their large size or for other reasons, were unable to shield themselves from the powerful rays. At the same time, new organisms would be created through mutations and macroevolution. See Velikovsky's comments in The Pitfalls of Radiocarbon Dating. In the catastrophe of the deluge, which I ascribe to Saturn exploding as a nova, the cosmic rays must have been very abundant to cause massive mutations among all species of life. Animals would suffer much more severely than plants. On plants, the principal effective would be mutagenic. See K.D. Terry and W.H. Tucker, Biologic Effects of Supernovae, 1968. Fred Hoyle, Does Epidemic Disease Come from Outer Space? 17th November, 1977.